What if the most dangerous thing in Tehran was not a bomb, but a woman everyone thought belonged there? She arrived as a widow with a soft voice, careful manners, and a past that seemed ordinary enough to survive casual questions. In a city built on suspicion, she learned very quickly that the safest lie is the one that feels almost boring. People did not stare at her because she dressed correctly, spoke correctly, and never asked for more attention than she was given. That made her easy to overlook. It also made her impossible to remember clearly, which was exactly the point. The man she lived with was not a minor official, not a desk officer, not someone who could be dismissed as background noise. He was an IRGC general with access to private papers, personal notes, and the kind of documents that never reached official files. In public, he was disciplined and severe. At home, he was something else entirely. Tired, guarded, proud, and increasingly willing to let one person into the rooms no one else could enter. She did not have to break into those rooms. She only had to be invited in and stay long enough for the routine to become invisible. That is where the real danger began. Not with a dramatic entrance, but with repetition. The same breakfast, the same greetings, the same hallway. The same locked study door that was sometimes left open for a few minutes too long. In operations like this, the threat is never one moment alone. It is the slow accumulation of small permissions, each one harmless by itself, each one making the next one easier. She understood that. Or at least she understood enough to keep going. She had been built for this kind of life. Not physically built, but trained into it, shaped by years of learning how to absorb detail without showing strain. She knew how to pause before answering. She knew how to look present without looking curious. She knew how to let silence do work for her. In a room full of people, she could make herself seem like the least important one there. In a house full of secrets, that was a form of camouflage more powerful than any disguise. But camouflage only works if the surroundings stay still. The first risk was obvious, even if she never said it aloud. One wrong question, one misplaced reaction, one inconsistency in her story, and the house could begin to change shape around her. The second risk was harder to name. It was not just that she might be caught, it was that living inside the lie for too long could make her hesitate at the exact moment hesitation would be fatal. The longer she remained, the more the false life asked for loyalty of its own. That was the part no training fully solved. By the time she had been there for several months, the household had settled into a rhythm that looked almost peaceful from the outside. The general trusted patterns. He trusted habit. He trusted the fact that the woman in his home did not behave like a threat. She moved through his space with the kind of careful familiarity that made her seem harmless. She knew when to speak and when to stay quiet. She knew which doors mattered and which ones were only decorative. She knew that people who guard secrets often become careless around the person they think has already been accepted. He had no reason to suspect her at first. That was what made the situation so dangerous. The real work began in the ordinary places. A desk left unattended for a moment. A stack of papers shifted and not restored exactly to its original position. A folder opened just long enough to reveal names, dates, routes, or coded annotations. She did not need to take everything, she only needed fragments. Intelligence work is often less about stealing a complete truth than collecting enough partial truths to understand the shape of the machine. A page number, a margin note, a stamp, a signature, a handwritten correction. Those small things are how hidden systems betray themselves. She was careful, but caution has limits when the target lives under the same roof. The house itself became a surveillance environment she had to survive every day. A maid who noticed too much. A driver who appeared in doorways at the wrong time. A relative who visited unexpectedly and asked the kind of questions relatives ask when they are really measuring distance. Even the general's moods mattered. If he was stressed, he watched people differently. If he was distracted, he forgot to lock things he normally locked. If he felt exposed, the whole atmosphere in the apartment shifted, and she had to adapt before anyone explained why. There were nights when she sat at the table with him and listened to him speak as if he were discussing family matters, only to realize that what he was actually revealing was structure, who reported to whom, which names were reliable, which offices were lying, which journeys had been approved without paper trails. Men like him rarely realize how much they say when they believe they are speaking safely. They assume the listener is there to be soothed, not recorded. That assumption is what creates openings. It is also what creates the deepest kind of exposure risk, because once a person begins speaking freely, they may later remember exactly how much they gave away. She kept her own face still through all of it. The most dangerous lie in the house was not the one she told him. It was the one she told herself. She told herself that each document photographed was just a document, that each day passed was just another day undercover, that the domestic routines were only a shell around the real task. But life under deception does not remain partitioned for long. The false identity begins demanding habits, preferences, reactions. It wants consistency. It wants emotional continuity. And if the person inside it is not careful, the legend starts to feel more complete than the self. That was the first slow cost, and it had not yet shown its full shape. There was another risk hanging over everything, one she could not control at all, the man himself. He was not blind, he was not stupid. He was a senior figure in a system built on paranoia, counterintelligence, and betrayal. Men like that do not survive by trusting too easily. They survive by choosing when not to ask questions. Sometimes that looks like confidence. Sometimes it looks like indifference. Sometimes it is something far more unsettling. The quiet decision to let uncertainty remain because certainty would force an action they are not ready to take. That possibility hung in the background of every conversation. He might have been deceived completely, or he might have been watching her with more awareness than she understood. He might have believed the story, or he might have only been postponing judgment. In either case, the tension was the same. Each day she remained in the house. The line between safety and exposure grew thinner, and no one could say with confidence which side of it she was on. She learned his habits the way a person learns weather. When he read in his study, when he stepped away from his desk, how long he stayed gone before returning, which papers he left untouched, and which ones he carried with him because they mattered too much to leave alone. She learned the sound of his footsteps in the corridor. She learned the difference between a closed door and a truly locked one. She learned how to move in ways that did not draw attention, and how to seem natural while doing things that were anything but natural. The first time she entered the study alone, she did not rush. That was the discipline that kept her alive. Not the ability to act, but the ability to delay. She looked at the room as if she belonged there, even though every instinct told her she did not. Files were stacked in deliberate order. Some were marked, some were not. There were notebooks with clipped handwriting, loose sheets with dates, and a small number of items that had clearly been handled often enough to matter. Nothing in the room shouted its importance. That was what made it dangerous. Important things are often stored in plain sight because the person protecting them assumes familiarity is security. She did not take the kind of risks that belong in fiction. No dramatic vaulting, no reckless search, no magical stroke of luck. Just patient observation, measured movement, and the knowledge that the smallest mistake could collapse months of work. The camera or device in her hand had to remain invisible, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged. Even her own body was part of the disguise. Fear had to be managed before it reached her face. Outside that room, the house continued around her as if nothing unusual were happening. That was the strangest part. Espionage often looks, from the inside, less like suspense and more like domestic repetition under pressure. The danger does not announce itself every minute. It waits, it accumulates, it hides inside ordinary minutes until ordinary minutes become the thing that breaks you. And somewhere in that repetition, a new problem began to form. It was not yet clear whether the problem belonged to her, to him, or to the space between them. A note left in the wrong place. A question asked a second too late. A pause in his voice that did not sound like suspicion, but did not sound like trust either. The kind of detail that means nothing until, suddenly, it means everything. She felt it before she could name it. The house had started to notice itself. By then, she had already crossed a threshold she could not easily explain to anyone outside the operation. She had stayed too long to return to a normal life without cost. She had seen too much to pretend the information did not matter. She had lived inside the role long enough that leaving would not simply mean leaving a house. It would mean abandoning a version of herself that had become necessary to survive. And that raised the question no one around her could safely ask. Was she still living with him because the mission required it, or because the lie had begun to choose her? The first crack in the illusion came from a source that did not exist on any official list. She had convinced herself that the risk was manageable because she controlled the environment. She knew the layout of the apartment, the timing of his movements, the habits of the staff. She had even begun to think of the house as a predictable system, a machine that conformed to a set of rules she could learn and exploit. The general, in this view, was a stubborn but not irrational man. She assumed he trusted because he saw no reason to doubt. That assumption was the first thing to break. What she had not fully accounted for was that people like him do not live in the same present she did. They live in a timeline where past betrayals repeat, where trusted faces have turned into informants, and where loyalty is never measured by behavior alone. To him, doubt was not a secondary emotion. It was the default. He did not need proof to be suspicious. He only needed enough reason to keep watching. The first time she realized this was not through a confrontation, but through a change in tone. He began asking her questions that were not framed as questions. He asked, for example, about her family in Isfahan with a precision that felt like testing. He listed names she had never mentioned and asked if they were related to her. She answered correctly, as any good operative would, but the way he studied her while she spoke was different. He did not look at her as if she might be lying. He looked at her as if he were scanning for the kind of lie that had already been told. That was the hidden risk no operations plan had spelled out. Not just that he might discover the truth, but that he might already be living in a half-realization of it and simply choosing not to act. The second risk was quieter, but it spread faster. She had begun to notice that the line between her own personality and the role she played was less sharply defined than it once was. She caught herself thinking in ways that suited the house, not the field. She corrected her own impulses, not because a mission demanded it, but because the house demanded it. She started to feel a strange kind of loyalty to the structure of the lie, to the shared rhythm of the apartment, to the unspoken rules that kept everyone safe. That was not part of the plan. It was a side effect of the deception itself. Deep cover work is built on the idea that the operative can step out of the role at any time, but no one warns you how hard it is to step back into the person you were before the lie. She had known intellectually that the cost would be real. She had just not imagined it as a gradual erosion, not a single moment. She had not thought about the way small choices would accumulate, the way she would start to care about whether dinner was good enough, whether the maid would notice a missing document, whether the driver would assume nothing. The house had become a system she felt responsible for, even though she was supposed to be its destroyer. The first true fracture came from a conversation with her handler. In a secure briefing, she was told that the value of what she had already collected was high enough to justify early extraction. The intelligence she had photographed had already triggered actions outside the house. Pathways they had mapped were being disrupted. Faces they had identified were being monitored. The risk of staying longer, the handler said, outweighed the value of the remaining material. Take what you have, leave before the pattern changes. She heard the words and understood them, but she also felt the lie inside her respond before she did. A part of her that had adapted to the rhythm of the house did not want to stop. She argued that the general's archive was not yet fully documented. She argued that the last few documents, the ones he had been working on most recently, could change the whole picture. She argued that leaving now would mean abandoning the most complete record of his network. The handler listened and then asked the question that exposed the real cost. "Are you sure this is about the mission?" The question hung in the air. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe it, but the truth was more complicated. She was still convinced that the mission mattered. She was also convinced that leaving now would mean admitting that the deception had reached a point where she could not easily separate herself from it. That was the cost no one had written into the operational plan, the possibility that the person who walked out of the house would not be the same person who had walked in. They discussed aborting. The abort sequence was laid out with mechanical clarity: a fabricated family emergency, a fixed travel window, a corridor of movement that had been mapped months ago. They could bring her out in under 72 hours if she agreed. She asked for time to think. That was the first time she hesitated along a line that had always been clear. At the same time, a new risk emerged from outside the house. A different Israeli asset had been arrested in Tehran. The arrest was not connected to her operation, but it set off a chain of security reviews. The Iranian counterintelligence apparatus began scanning its usual channels, looking for patterns, anomalies, weak signals. Her own communications, which had been assessed as low risk, were placed into a larger pool of traffic that suddenly attracted more attention. The people in Tel Aviv did not know how much longer the window would stay open. She did not either. Inside the house, the change in him deepened. He began to ask questions that were not about her past, but about her behavior. He asked why she never seemed to need anything from him, why she never asked for favors, why she never fell into the kind of emotional dependency that most people in her position would have showed. He asked in a way that sounded almost casual why someone who had endured the losses she described had such a calm temperament. She answered with the same steady voice she had used from the beginning. She explained that she had spent years adjusting. She spoke of grief as a process, not a performance. She sounded convincing because, in a way, she was. Some of the things she said were true. Some of them were deformations of the truth. The lie and the truth had begun to share the same language. The more she spoke, the more she realized that the real danger was not a single mistake. It was the accumulation of micro-inconsistencies, a pause that was too fast, a detail that was too precise, a memory that aligned too perfectly with the story she had rehearsed. She had to walk a line where authenticity looked just flawed enough to seem human, but not so flawed that it raised suspicion. The hidden risk was that the longer she stayed, the more the house would begin to feel like home. She started to recognize that she could no longer think of the mission as something separate from her emotional reality. She had seen the general in his unguarded moments. She had watched him deal with bureaucratic frustrations, with slights from senior officials, with the quiet indignity of being reduced to a mid-level coordinator despite his rank. She had listened as he expressed worries about his daughter, about his own irrelevance, about the way decisions were being made far above him. In those moments, he sounded like a man who had spent his life in service to a machine that did not always reward him. That was not the kind of thing she was supposed to relate to. The internal doubt that had begun to form was not about whether she could succeed. It was about who she would become if she did. She had entered the mission as a professional. She had entered it believing she could contain the emotional cost. But the house had changed that. It had created a space where empathy and strategy occupied the same room. She had to be close enough to the general to photograph his documents, but distant enough to use them against him. That was the contradiction she could not resolve. On the night she decided whether to stay or abort, she sat in the apartment while he slept. The house felt still. The street outside was quiet. The city carried on in its usual mixture of noise and distance. She had access to the study. She had a few minutes when he was in the bathroom. She could go in and take what she still needed. She could satisfy the part of her that did not want to leave without completing the work. But completing the work meant staying longer. Staying longer meant living inside the lie for more days she had not planned. Each day increased the chance that the Iranian counterintelligence apparatus would connect the anomaly in her communications to a living person. Each day increased the chance that the general would decide the doubt he had been carrying was worth acting on. She opened the door to the study. She did not step inside. The abort discussion had made her realize that the operation had passed a threshold where staying was no longer simply a tactical decision. It was an emotional one. She could not say with certainty that she was prolonging the mission because it was necessary. She could not say she was shortening it because it was safe. She could only admit to herself that both explanations were partly true and partly an excuse. The mandatory mid-script reframe arrived not as a single revelation, but as a slow collapse of an assumption that he was the only one being deceived. She had built the operation on the belief that he trusted her. She had based much of her confidence on the fact that he had not confronted her, had not interrogated her, had not locked the study when she was in it. She had taken that as evidence of his trust. But as the days passed, she began to understand that trust was not the only emotion animating his behavior. He was watching. He was watching her and deciding whether the game was worth continuing. He was watching to see if the person he had let into his home was worth the risk of keeping. He was watching to see if her loyalty, real or feigned, was functional. The assumption that he had been fully deceived was the first thing to break. The second thing to break was the assumption that she could leave without damage. The abort discussion had shown her that even the people who had sent her thought it was time to pull back. They saw the risk, they saw the pattern, they saw her hesitation. They did not know the full extent of her internal fracture, but they saw enough to question whether she could still be relied upon to make decisions that were only about the mission. And that left her with a question she could not answer clearly. If she stayed, was she prolonging the deception to complete the mission, or to complete the role she had grown into? If she left, was she escaping the house, or escaping the self that had become accustomed to living inside it? When she finally closed the study door that night, she did not know whether she had chosen the mission, chosen herself, or chosen something in between. The house remained unchanged. The documents stayed on the desk. The city outside continued, and the only certainty was uncertainty. She woke up one morning convinced she had already decided. The abort window was still open. The extraction plan had been prepared, timed, and vetted. All she had to do was follow the instructions, let the family emergency script unfold, and let the house swallow her departure without remembering every detail. She had rehearsed the steps so many times they felt automatic. That was the problem. Automatic did not mean right. The day began like any other. She made tea. She listened for his footsteps. She watched the way he carried his keys, the way he glanced at the study door before leaving. She told herself that this would be the last time she did these things. She told herself that the tea she poured was the last tea she would pour in this apartment. She told herself that the lie was ending, that soon she would be back in a place where people knew her by a name she had not built for someone else. It felt like a clean boundary. It felt like closure. It was also a lie. By mid-morning, a small detail broke the illusion. A phone call arrived from someone he had not expected. The conversation was brief, muffled, but the tone shifted immediately. He ended the call, looked at the study door, and then at her for a moment too long. He did not speak. He only walked to the study and closed the door behind him. He did not lock it, but the way he stood there for a second, as if testing the weight of the decision, made her realize that the house had changed without her permission. That was the false start. She had believed she had already decided to leave. The house had not gotten the message. She spent the next hour waiting for a sign that the study would be left open. She timed his movements. She listened for the sound of pages turning. She watched the corridor, waiting for him to step out, momentarily distracted. Nothing happened. The door stayed closed. The apartment felt heavier. She realized, with a kind of slow dread, that she had been counting on the timing of the extraction to match the rhythm of the house. She had assumed that the house would cooperate just long enough for her to take what she still needed before she left. That assumption was incorrect. The house did not know it was about to be abandoned. It did not care. The first real hesitation came when she considered ignoring the extraction plan. She had convinced herself that she had chosen to abort. She had told herself that the mission was complete enough, that staying longer was unjustifiable. But standing in the apartment, listening to the silence behind the study door, she realized that a part of her had already rejected that decision. The part of her that had lived in this house, that had learned to move in this space, that had adjusted to this version of time, did not want to leave without finishing. Leaving without finishing felt like walking away from a sentence she had started to write. She sat in the living room and told herself to wait. She told herself that if the door opened in the next hour, she would take what she needed and then stick to the extraction plan. If it did not, she would leave the house as it was and let the mission end where it had been forced to end. That compromise satisfied the professional in her. It also pleased the part of her that still wanted to complete the work. The house did not cooperate. The study door stayed shut. By early afternoon, she realized that the abort window would close in less than 12 hours. The extraction plan had hard dependencies. Beyond that window, the carefully constructed chain of movement would no longer be safe. She had to decide now. She walked to the door and knocked. It was not the rehearsed way she usually did it. She knocked twice, waited, then knocked once more. The rhythm was off. The hesitation showed in the sound. He opened the door. He looked at her differently, not with suspicion at first, but with something like surprise. He had not been expecting her to bother him there. The study was his private space, the one place in the house where he did not invite her in without reason. She had rarely crossed that threshold uninvited. She said the words she had been holding in reserve. "I need to finish something." She did not say document or page or file. She did not say what specifically. She only said that she had been thinking about what she had seen earlier, what she still had questions about, what might make the difference later. She spoke vaguely, the way someone who did not know the full scope of the archive would speak. She watched his face for signals, for any sign that he already knew why she was there. He studied her for a moment that felt longer than it was, then he stepped aside. That was the near abort. She had come to the door expecting to be told no, to be told the house was closing, to be told that the study was no longer accessible. She had come prepared to accept that and walk away, but instead, he opened the door. The false release moment arrived instantly. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. The room felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The documents were where she had seen them last. The same notebooks, the same folders, the same marginal notes. But the air was different. It felt like the house had shifted, like the walls had remembered everything she had done there and were now watching her response. She moved slowly. She did not rush. She did not grab the first folder that caught her eye. She scanned the desk, not for the most important document, but for the one that looked recently handled. Her incorrect assumption was that time had not changed the way he organized his work. She assumed that the newest material would follow the same pattern, that the most recent changes would be in the same place they had been a month ago. She was wrong. The current version of the archive was in a different stack, one she had not fully recognized before. She had seen it from the corner of her eye, thought it was temporary, and ignored it. Now she realized that it was the center of the most recent work. Her hesitation showed in the way she paused, mid-movement, as that realization landed. She had come to the study believing she knew what she was looking for. She had come believing she could complete the last section of the timeline document quickly. The document was not where she thought it was. She glanced at the door. He had not left the study with her. He had stepped back to the window where he often stood when he needed to think without turning his back on the room. His presence created a new problem. She could not pretend she needed privacy to concentrate. She could not linger without giving him a reason to suspect that she was not simply reading, but recording. The incorrect assumption playing out was brutal. She had believed that finishing the last section would take only a few minutes. She had believed that she could photograph the remaining pages without drawing attention. She had believed that the window for extraction would still be open after she did. The room was too small for that belief to survive. She opened the wrong folder first. It was not the one she had planned. It was a nearby stack that looked similar, that had the same kind of binding, the same kind of handwriting. She lifted the cover, aware that he was watching, aware that every movement had to look like curiosity, not calculation. She glanced at the pages, saw that they were not what she needed. She closed the folder. That was the false start inside the false start. He did not say anything. He did not look alarmed. He looked instead attentively neutral. That was the most dangerous response. It did not tell her what he was thinking. It did not tell her whether he had noticed the hesitation, the second when she paused over the wrong stack, the micro break in her rhythm. She could not read his face clearly enough to know if she had been given away or if he was simply observing the way she moved in his space. She tried again. She picked up the correct folder this time. She told herself that this was all she needed. She told herself that the extraction plan would still work. She told herself that the documents in her hands were worth the risk of staying a little longer. She opened the folder. The pages were there. The handwriting was his. The annotations were recent. The last section of the timeline document lay in front of her, partially filled, partially crossed out, partially rewritten. She had the material she had been hesitating over. She had the final piece of the archive. For a second, it felt like resolution. Then she remembered the abort window. The extraction plan depended on her leaving the house that evening, not the next day. Not in a few hours. Not after one more task. Tonight. Now. Every second she spent in the study, every second she spent pretending to read while she secretly photographed, was a second that pushed her outside the safe corridor. The false release moment was not that she had found what she needed. It was that she believed, for a brief moment, that she could have both. She believed she could photograph the last pages and still walk out on schedule. She believed that the mission and the exit could coexist. They could not. She stood there, the folder in her hands, the study door closed, the general watching from the window, and realized that she had been wrong about almost everything she had assumed that morning. She had not already decided to leave. She had not already chosen the abort window. She had not known where the final documents were. She had not understood how narrow the corridor for escape had become. The hesitation was no longer about the mission. It was about the self. If she stayed to photograph the pages, she might miss the extraction window. If she left now, she would leave the house with the last piece of the archive still undocumented. She told herself that leaving incomplete was still better than getting caught. She told herself that getting caught would not only end the mission but erase everything she had already done. She put the folder down, not slowly, not dramatically, just down. She closed the cover. She did nothing that looked like finality. She simply stopped. Then she walked toward the door. He did not move. He did not ask what she had seen. He did not ask why she had come in. He only watched her leave the room, the same way he watched everything in the house. When she stepped into the hallway, the house felt different. She told herself that she had made the right choice. She told herself that the extraction plan would still work. She told herself that the mission was done, that she had given it all she could. The false release moment was complete. She would find out later, outside the house, that she had been wrong about that too. The consequences began before she left the apartment. The first sign was the extraction corridor. She had been told the window was precise, that the route was still valid, that the checkpoints had not yet changed their protocols. But when she stepped out that evening, the city did not feel the same. The police presence at one of the secondary crossings had increased. A routine inspection that was supposed to be a formality took longer than it should have. The officer's questions were not pointed, but they were detailed. He asked for documents she had been prepared to show, then asked for a second set she had not been told to carry. She answered correctly, calmly, and the officer let her pass. But the delay was real. The extraction did not happen on schedule. The operation did not end when the plan said it would. It bled into the next hour, the next checkpoint, the next stretch of road, each one carrying the accumulated weight of every decision she had made in the house. The abort window had been a clean line on paper. In reality, it was a narrowing corridor that did not stay open long enough for her to move through it exactly as she had been told she would. By the time she crossed the border into the third country, the operation had already begun to unravel behind her. Inside Iran, the house reacted in ways she could not see. The first response was bureaucratic, not immediate. The archive was reviewed, not discarded. The documents were reorganized, not burned. The IRGC counterintelligence apparatus began a slow, internal accounting of who had been in contact with the general, who had access to the apartment, who had moved through the space in the months before the woman disappeared. The extraction did not erase the fact that someone had been there. It only made it harder to prove who that someone had been. The house started to treat the lie as a structural problem, not a single event. The general was not immediately removed from his post, but he was moved to a role with less access. The study was reorganized. The kind of documents he had carried in plain sight were moved to more secure channels. The people who had been in that circle were questioned, not all at once, but in waves, as if the institution were trying to absorb the cost without admitting the full depth of the breach. The immediate fallout was not a single arrest or dramatic revelation. It was a subtle tightening of the system, the kind of tightening that makes future operations harder, denser, more dangerous. The operation had already changed the environment it had been designed to infiltrate. The long-term strategic consequences were not fully clear for years, but the patterns began to show early. The network of shell companies and front organizations that had been mapped from the photographs did not vanish overnight. Some of them were disrupted. Some of them were dismantled. Some of them were quietly restructured. The faces that had been identified began to disappear from the visible layer of the Iranian security apparatus, sometimes through official transfers, sometimes through unexplained absences. The timeline document, the one she had hesitated to complete, left a partial shadow. The sections that had been photographed were enough to trigger targeted actions, but the sections that had not were just as important. The Iranian side, once it realized the archive had been accessed, began to reconstruct what had been seen. They assumed, incorrectly, that the last section had been fully documented. They adjusted their operations as if the full sequence had been exposed, when in fact it had not. The operation had created a distorted mirror. The enemy had changed because of partial information, not complete knowledge. That was the kind of consequence that looks like success from the outside, but feels like uncertainty from the inside. The Iranian system had shifted, but not in a way that any analyst could fully map. The operation had disrupted something, but no one could be sure how much it had broken and how much it had hardened. The personal cost arrived in pieces. The first piece was the house itself. Once she was out, the apartment in Tehran stopped being a place she moved through and became a place she had to keep active in her mind as a memory. The objects she had handled, the routines she had followed, the conversations she had overheard, the gestures she had mirrored. All of it became residue. She could not discard the house because the house had become part of the way she understood herself. The woman who had stood in that study, the woman who had watched the general, the woman who had walked out the door with the folder still in his hands, she could not be fully separated from the role she had played. The second piece was the general. She had told herself that he was a target, not a person. That was the fiction she had needed to survive. But the house had refused to let her hold that fiction cleanly. She had seen him in moments that did not fit the narrative of the enemy. She had seen him distracted, lonely, uncertain, annoyed at the machine he served. Those images did not disappear just because the operation had ended. They stayed in her memory like fragments of a building that had collapsed but still cast a shadow. The third piece was the abort. The decision to leave the last section of the timeline document behind did not feel like a clean choice. It felt like a fracture. She had been trained to think that any mission could be cut short without losing its value. The reality was messier. The operation had already begun to shape the way she thought about herself and the people around her. Aborting the final section felt like leaving a sentence unfinished, like walking away from a conversation in the middle of the most important line. The cost of that decision was not measured in documents left behind, but in the way she would keep returning to the moment she closed the folder and walked away. The institutional cost was harder to see from the outside. The operation was documented, analyzed, and filed. Lessons were written, procedures were adjusted. The Mossad did not repeat the exact same pattern immediately, but it also did not abandon the underlying model. The operation had shown that deep cover infiltration of senior Iranian figures was possible, but it had also shown that the cost of such operations was not just risk of capture. It was the cost of the operative's internal adjustment to the lie. It was the way the house, the target, the environment could begin to feel more real than the organization that had sent her there. Inside the institution, the operation was both a case study and a cautionary tale. It was cited as an example of how long-term infiltration could yield valuable intelligence, but it was also used to push back against the idea that such operations could be repeated without acknowledging the psychological toll. The abort discussion, the hesitation, the incomplete final section of the timeline document, all of it became part of the internal narrative about what could go wrong when the operative stayed too long inside the role. The restrained CTA is not a call to celebration, not a call to repeat the same operation. It is a call to recognize that the most dangerous operations are not the ones that end in dramatic explosions, but the ones that change the people who conduct them slowly, quietly, and without their full consent. The call is to understand that the cost of deception does not only belong to the person who is deceived, it also belongs to the person who maintains the lie, to the institution that sends them, and to the system that must absorb the consequences of partial truths and incomplete decisions. The operation ended, but the consequences did not. They spread into the corridors of other houses, into the habits of other operatives, into the structure of other systems. The woman who had lived in that apartment carries the memory of it. The general, wherever he is, carries his own version of the same story. The institutions that watched, planned, and reacted carry the operational record. The only clear conclusion is that the operation had never been a single event. It was a chain of decisions, each one carrying the weight of the ones that came before. The fallout was not a line that ended when the extraction was complete. It was a series of echoes that continued to shape the way people think about trust, deception, and the cost of living inside a lie.